Welcome back to Critic Proof. I'm your host, Alyssa Rosenberg, the critic at Think Progress, and I'm joined today by New Republic staff writer Marc Tracy to discuss, a little belatedly after Father's Day, but timely for some other reasons, a terrific piece that he wrote lately that he sort of called Kicking Off the Daddy Wars, an alternative to the Mommy Wars, but that really is an exploration of a question that I think has been very underexplored in our debates about work-life balance, the fact that men don't have it all. Women may not have it all, but men have never had it all. And, you know, I thought it was a terrific piece. And Marc, I'd be really curious, you know, if you could both walk us through it and talk about some of the feedback you've gotten, since it was definitely a provocative argument, particularly given some of the other sort of dumber writing on the subject that you were responding to.
Yeah, no, I mean, actually, now that it's a really good question because I'm thinking about the feedback I've received, and the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. Interestingly, it has come mostly from women, which is interesting, and something I hadn't really even realized until you asked me that. And I guess the reason that's interesting is part of the point I was making is that the discussion of having it all and also of actually being a parent and, you know, what kind of parent one should be, and the work-life balance is typically a conversation that takes place more among women, and there are reasons for that, and part of that is that, frankly, the obstacles are, I would argue, are probably greater for women than for men for a variety of reasons. But I definitely think the reaction's been positive because I think women understand that if they want to, and again, I think I say this in the piece, I don't know if I want to have it all, I don't really care if I want to have it all, but I know there are certain things I want, and certain things I want is for part of the discussion among men, both fathers and would-be fathers, is that part of the discussion should be not just career, and not just ambition in career, but ambition to be a father and to be, you know, hopefully, especially if that's what you want and what your partner wants, you know, a very active father, maybe breaking out a little bit of what we typically think of as the fatherly roles, that is, maybe of the breadwinner. You know, there's lots of things, you know, there was a Pew study that came out, I don't have the stats directly in front of me, but, you know, there's an increasing number of households where the woman is the primary breadwinner, and those households where both the men and the women, where the woman's the primary breadwinner, have a higher median income, where there are two parents. I mean, part of this is skewed, and part of this entire discussion is skewed because of the phenomenon of single mothers, which is an important part of this. But no, I mean, I was writing that both literally selfishly, as actually, you know, a man who hopes one day to be married with kids and, you know, to be a father who actually, like my father, you know, plays an active role and not just a kind of distant breadwinning role. Obviously, I'm building a million straw men here, but, you know, but also selfishly in terms of for men generally, I think it's good for men, but also I think for women. I mean, I think if, you know, the conversation about the mommy wars and about, you know, women's work-life balance is sort of one half of an equation that's probably to some extent going to have another half, right? So if women want to be mothers who are also in the workforce and ambitious about their jobs and their careers and giving a lot of time to their jobs and their careers, that is going to necessitate in many cases, you know, a partner, you know, more often than not a man, a father, who is willing to do more of the things that in previous generations would have been left to the woman. And I mean, you see this in the Anne-Marie Slaughter piece where she talks about, and she's very, to her credit, you know, she gives a ton of credit to her husband for, you know, when she was commuting between Princeton and D.C., you know, for picking up the slack for doing that. And my contention is that, you know, there's nothing wrong. And again, I mean, like, part of it is this sort of discourse is still somewhat new to me, so I probably am not as precise about it as I should be, and I'm sure there's an extent to which I want all fathers to be this way. I'm sure there's an extent to which, you know, I want fathers to be able to choose in consultation with their partners, you know, what kind of fathers they want to be. But I just think it's a discussion that isn't had, and I think it's a discussion. It's funny, I went to a panel last week on working parenthood that featured 4 women talking. It's funny, when I asked a question, one of them was like, oh, male voice, how about that? And needless to say, the audience was mostly women. even though, as I say, the title of the panel was Working Parenthood. And one of the panelists, who is a writer, it was Jess Gross at Slate, who writes about this stuff very intelligently and very well, said that despite the fact that she had worked in women's magazines, I guess she's your colleague at Slate, that lots of these questions hadn't even occurred to her until she became pregnant. And so if it's not even occurring to not only a woman, but a woman who works in, among other things, women's magazines until she got pregnant, imagine how hard it is to start this conversation among childless or even unmarried men. I mean, it seems as distant as the moon, and it does seem as distant as the moon, frankly, at an emotional level, but at the same time, it's not as distant as the moon, and I think it's really important that men talk about this and that they start talking about it now. And Father's Day was, recently, and so I said, this is for Father's Day. And I said, I began the piece by noting that, Father's Day was inspired by Mother's Day, and that's the least surprising fact you'll ever hear, right? Of course it was. Of course Mother's Day came first.
Well, I think you're getting at two interesting things. And the first is that, when we frame sort of having it all in work-life balance as issues that solely pertain to women, that sets up a sort of antagonistic conversation, right, where women are supposed to sort of demand more from their partners or make all of the scheduling sacrifices. If we accept that parenting is sort of a fixed quantity, there's, a certain amount of minimum hours you have to be, doing childcare or at least covering childcare. If it's only a women's issue and there's nothing for men to gain from it, then it's inevitably going to be an antagonistic conversation. It's going to be sort of asking men to rearrange their lives without sort of consultation about their preferences or their interests. And that seems like a conversation that is doomed to produce a lot of frustration.
Right.
But that gets at the second thing that you're talking about, which is that, getting people to think about what they actually want. And I think that one of the problems with conversations about having it all is that it relies on the idea that there's a sort of static understanding of what having it all looks like, but there are many paths to get there. And, I think in reality, we need to think a lot more about what having it all means individually. Arianna Huffington did this conference at her home in New York called The Third Metric, and one of the things that sort of came up again and again in this conversation about sort of the search for success was this saying, and I'd have to look up the origins, but it's become widely repeated, that you can have it all, just not at the same time. And I think that's sort of insufficient, right? If you've decided that what is important to you, like what your all is staying home with your kids, then you have it all, by your own definition. And so, I think if we're framing the conversation with a rigid definition of all, that means, both having a professional career and having children, that doesn't actually leave a lot of flex. And I think, reckoning with the fact that not all parents are going to want to work. Not all parents are going to want to be full-time parents. It all is to me, is sort of really the place where I think almost richer work can be done in this conversation. And I think that, that opens up a conversation to men that they have either been excluded from or excluded themselves from in a lot of
I think it's more excluded themselves, frankly, which is a thing I definitely... one point I made is just I see it happen every day. I see the conversation happen every day, both online and literally among women I know. And I don't think they've been shutting me out of it deliberately. I think that I haven't been including myself, and even more, I think my conversation is a little different from their conversation. I don't think, it's equivalent. I think that's partly due to, obviously social constructions that are certainly haven't been wiped away, probably will never be wiped away. And I say probably will never be wiped away because there is a pretty hard to get around biological thing going on here, which is that the actual act of having a child is, puts a lot more physical strain on the woman than on the man. There's, it's just, men don't have to be pregnant for 9 months and don't have to have the aftermath of that pregnancy and don't have to feed the baby. And it's different. And which is why I assume ultimately the social constructions will never quite go away because they stem in part from that. But no, I mean, I see this conversation happen. It's a good conversation. It's a conversation that's going to prepare women for when they become mothers, and it's going to help them live more informed lives. And it would be great if men could do that too. And I mean, it's not that we don't have good examples to choose from. As I say, my father did work, but he used to come when I was in preschool. I went to a Jewish preschool, and every Friday we had chapel because it was Friday. And my dad he never missed one. And he came from work, and it would be a sea of moms and literally one father, and it would be my dad there with me. So I mean, it's not like I don't have some sort of template for this or some starting point for this, and I assume that's true of many young men of my generation. But if we're not having the conversation, then it's just going to sneak up on us, and we're not going to be thinking about it, and it might inform life choices we make beforehand. It might not. It might inform discussions we have with our potential wives. It might not. But it's just, I don't know, it's a good thing to talk about. And it's a total different field from the things I ordinarily think about. Like I think, like many, like I'm taught to be ambitious. The word ambitious is almost synonymous with ambition in career. There are other things to be ambitious about.
Sure.
And again, I agree with you that finding the balance and finding what you want to be ambitious about needs to some extent to be specific to each person. But I don't think you can even have that conversation until you at least this enters into it.
One thing I'd be curious about is whether this is a conversation you've had with your male friends at all before or after you wrote the piece. Because if it's new to you, I assume it would be sort of new to guys sort of in your situation or in your orbit. But I'd be curious, what those conversations sound like.
A little bit. First, I should give a shout out. There's a big exception because the post was this sort of first sort of over manifestation of a long conversation that I've been having with a friend of mine whose name is Avi Zellerman. He is a former journalist, so you might know his name or his byline. He's not a journalist anymore, and we've actually been maintaining a Tumblr, which literally just for the benefit of the two of us, which I linked to in the article, daddywars.tumblr.com. I think he probably coined the phrase daddy wars. Certainly, I'm not as good with phrases as he is, so I imagine he coined it. And so he and I have been talking about this for a while because it's something that, is something that's occurred to both of us and is important to both of us. It's with that exception, and even that's kind of an exception because we talk about it partly in the context of, wow, it's funny how nobody talks about this. I think the conversation among men gets... I think lots of young men my age, and this is anecdotally, men I talk to, realize that there's this whole sort of conversation about family generally that isn't really talked about. And this, one way I think about it is that, take getting into college, right? Getting into college is not, in the scheme of things, it seems, I know when we're 17, it seems like the most important thing in the world. Mm-hmm. Which college you get into out of the 10 you apply to, and whether you apply early decision or regular, it's really not the biggest deal in the world. You're probably going to end up fine. And yet think how much of your life at that point was devoted to, explicit discussions of that. Think how many hours you spent with the college counselor, with your parents, with the applications, with books, and just how much it weighed on your psyche, compared to the much more amorphous but much more important question of having a family, which I know there are books about child raising and stuff like that, and I know, obviously, especially among women, there's this huge conversation about work-life balance, about having it all. But among men, I feel like it's not really discussed, and it's almost sublimated into our pop culture, into sitcoms. Most sitcoms, I was noticing this actually. One thing I noticed is I was watching the Friends pilot for some reason, and the Friends pilot begins with two weddings being broken up. It's Rachel's wedding being broken up as she leaves the altar, and Ross has been married, and then his wife tells him that she's a lesbian. So that's the beginning of the show, and when you think about it, most sitcoms are about this period in life. And I almost think that, and I'm sure you can speak to this much better than I could, I almost think that this is a reflection of precisely the extent to which we, and especially men, who are frankly probably creating the majority of these sitcoms, don't talk about this stuff explicitly. Instead of talking about it explicitly, we make jokes about it that run to a nice, 22-minute length, and then it's on to the next one.
And I think that sitcoms, there are sort of 2 points I want to make here. The first is that sitcoms have often dealt with sort of fathers' anxieties about their role in their families by making dads incompetent. That's an ancient sitcom trope.
Father knows best, right?
Yeah, father knows best. We had a whole show on NBC, Up All Night, that was, sorry, not Up All Night, Guys with Kids, that was based literally on Jimmy Fallon seeing a bunch of guys with their kids in the park and thinking, whoa, there are men taking care of kids. Isn't this freakish and strange? And so the thing about the sort of incompetent father trope is that it's both insulting to men who do a good job with their children, and it's, it's insulting to those men, and then it's also, I think really difficult for, but it absolves them of responsibility, right? If men aren't supposed to be good at raising children, then, who cares, right? It doesn't matter.
Right.
But it's, it's a way of sort of managing that anxiety and pushing it off. And I think there were, 2 sitcoms that have been very interesting, that both are created by women and that, deal with this in a very different way. And it's, there was Up All Night, which was created by a woman, and the initial premise of that is that Will Arnett was playing a stay-at-home dad, while his wife, played by Christina Applegate, was working in this fairly high-powered job as a television show producer. And, the show was really sort of open and interesting about the fact that, this was something that Will Arnett's character really wanted to be doing. It was important to him, but it also, it caused him some anxieties. He missed his job as a lawyer. He missed being in an office. He missed, the sort of social stimulation of being around other men and sort of other professional men. And so, it was very interesting to watch this character really, and I think part of what his character was struggling with on Up All Night was that he wasn't getting sort of social support for this decision that he had made, and that was very complicated for him. And I thought that was a really sort of touching, interesting thing for the show to do, but it didn't appear to land. The show's ratings weren't terribly good. It got retooled, repeatedly, and ultimately was canceled. I mean, they literally had sort of stripped everything out of the show, and, we're trying to find a way to make it work. But, one of the biggest things they did in the second season was send Will Arnett's character back to work. They had just sort of given up on the idea that, men or even that women would be interested in this show about a guy sort of struggling with a lot of things that women deal with on a regular basis. And, I thought that was unfortunate that the show didn't work out. And I wonder if it didn't work out because that subtext was really made text, it was kind of an interesting thing. And then the other sitcom that I think that did better, in part because it made sort of the question of having it all subtext rather than text, was 30 Rock, which never really gets credit for being a show about how men can't have it all. That's a very that's kind of not something that you think of 30 Rock being about, but in the finale...
Right, you think about Liz Lemon.
Yeah. No, you think about it as sort of Liz's quest for meaning and, and for a stable boyfriend, a husband, kids, etc. And that's the text of the show. But the subtext is a lot about Jack Donaghy's life. And Jack actually has sort of a much worse record of all of this stuff than Liz does. He has this string of failed marriages. He has this string of girlfriends that he can never quite get it to work with. He ultimately, has a daughter named Liddy, who ends up being effectively raised by his nanny because he's not willing to give up, his sort of hard-charging corporate job. and, his wife is being held captive in North Korea.
And he finds his meaning in work.
Exactly. But at the end of 30 Rock, something really interesting happens. Liz Lemon, is married, has a husband who's decided to stay at home and raise their adopted twins. Her show has come to its end, but she seems pretty confident that she's going to find new work. And Jack Donaghy is freaking out. He literally decides to run away on his boat because he can't deal with sort of how screwed up his life is. He doesn't have a partner. He doesn't necessarily have a job anymore. His life is just a mess. And It was very interesting that the woman who has been very sort of publicly and intentionally questioning work-life balance, and sort of, how her life is going to work, ends up okay, where the man who has sort of presented himself as this master of the universe has ended up with nothing. And, in the sort of coda to the show, Liz is working again, and Jack sort of has the string of girlfriends and is back at work, but Liz has it all, and Jack has some of it. Or Liz has her version of it all, and Jack has his version of it all. But I thought that was just an incredibly sort of sly thing for the show to do, and, not much commented on.
Yeah, Jack Donaghy's going to have to be like, and he self-consciously, one interesting thing about Jack Donaghy that sort of feeds into that is, even in his other decisions, in the way he chooses to present himself, the sort of ethos he identifies with is this very sort of classic, self-consciously throwback image to a time when this is what men did.
And this was how men looked, and this is how men presented themselves, and, men are breadwinners, and it's, and it hasn't really worked out for him. I mean, Jack is arguably more miserable than Liz is.
Right. That's a great way of thinking about it. That totally hadn't occurred to me, but you're right, it's completely there. And I think, when I say I'd never thought to think about it this way, but when you just watch the show, it sort of gets in at you. Like, there's something very sad about Jack, and you see it come out, but it's always covered up by Irish jokes, which might be, the way it is in real life, but that doesn't mean the sadness isn't there. So, wow, you managed to turn 30 Rock into something that's making me sad. So I guess that's impressive.
Well, and that actually brings me to another show that has some unfortunate resonance this week. We're taping shortly after the memorial service for James Gandolfini. And, I've been rewatching The Sopranos this week, and one thing that struck me is, the episode where Tony is sort of diagnosed with this symptom for psychopaths who, need, or antisocial personalities, where they need constant stimulation. And he's told that he can't go, he has to sort of, by his lawyer, that he has to distance himself from his work in the mob. And so he goes to this, job at Brown Sanitation, but he also just spends a bunch of time hanging around the house, and he's totally at loose ends, in part because, has ended up in a position that a lot of women do, which is that he's sort of staying at home at a moment when his kids don't need him that much anymore. And he sort of really wants to connect to AJ, his son, and it takes him a long time to figure out how to do that. Tony Soprano is sort of thrust into the daddy wars in a way that the show is a lot more conscious about.
I remember those episodes, and it's amazing. I'm also thinking back, because that's in season 2, and I think this might have been right before that happens in season 2. I have not gone on a binge. I've just kind of been thinking about the show a lot, and it's a show I'm very, very, very familiar with. And by the way, the photos of the memorial service for Gandolfini are incredible, in part because you've seen all these people at many funerals before. They've just been fictional funerals. It's bizarre. It's completely, that show has a rate of about one funeral every 3 episodes, of course. In Tony's vision of being a father, we were just talking about Jack Donaghy being a throwback, is relentlessly throwback. We know there's that famous line, out there it's the 90s, in here it's 1952, or whatever the line is.
1954, yes.
Right.
You're not supposed to talk about sex.
And again, right around them, one thing is, he comes home, he's really drunk. I think it might have had to do with when he when he bankrupts his old friend, who's the degenerate gambler, who owns the sporting goods store. And, he's drunk, and it's clearly something wrong, and Meadow comes in and sees him. And, he says, everything I do it all for you guys. Right. And there's something really amazing about that, because he, in a way, it's true, and it's one of those crazy, Tony Soprano non-sociopath moments, although maybe it actually is Tony Soprano sociopath. But I think with his kids, especially with Meadow, he really is sincere, but the way he provides for them, he doesn't see being a present dad as being part of that. He doesn't see being a faithful husband as part of that, and frankly, that's actually, I would argue, probably really important to being a good father. It's nice to be a faithful husband and to set a good example for your son and your daughter. And that's hard to talk about. But I mean, back to the episodes you were mentioning where he has to stay at home. It's true. He just and that's the connecting to the diagnosis of the antisocial disorder. The other person in the show who's diagnosed, albeit from afar, with that same disorder is, of course, Tony's mother. And the way Dr. Melfi puts it is, some people aren't great candidates for motherhood. Which on the one hand sounds like a terrible thing to say, but on the other hand, there's no reason why that shouldn't be true. And so I guess that would suggest that Tony is not a good candidate for fatherhood, which is just hard to think about.
Yeah, well, Tony's attitude towards fatherhood is also, just really sort of primally predatory in certain ways. You mentioned the episode where he's bankrupting Meadow's friend's father. And, part of what he does there in that episode is that he accepts Meadow's friend's car as partial payment for his father's debt. And he comes home and just brings the car to Meadow and expects her to be excited about it. It's literally like he hauled home an antelope from the savannah. It's like, here, I provided for you. I brought you meat / a vehicle to drive in. And he has no sense of sort of social context or his children's social needs or what their relationships are. It's like a straight primal provider mentality.
Well, I would almost say it's even worse than that, because what it does is it also, if Meadow accepts that car, I think she ends up accepting it, even though she's originally obviously discussed it, is maybe that's not actually part of it. But what it does is it also kind of makes Meadow a little bit complicit in what Tony does, which obviously, kind of the central narrative of the show is almost, to what extent is he corrupting his family? And obviously with Carmela, it's a little more clear-cut. She's an enabler, she's complicit, and it's a lot of that's why Meadow has such issues with Carmela, in the middle part of the show. There's an episode that ends with, Meadow, it's where Meadow is threatening to run off to Europe, and Tony and Carmela are talking about it, and Tony's like, I don't know what to do, and Carmela's like, what are you worried about? She doesn't blame you, she blames me. Yeah. It's like, what for? She doesn't answer, and the episode ends. What Meadow blames Carmela for is essentially marrying Tony and marrying him and putting up with him being the criminal sociopath that he is.
Sure. And
which in turn makes her...
Yeah, and of course, Meadow also has her dalliance with Jackie Aprile Jr., where Tony actually probably does, sort of the best fathering he does in the entire show, right? He's relatively hands-off with Meadow herself about the relationship, but because Jackie keeps sort of putting himself in Tony's context, he tries to get Jackie to behave well, right? He tries to provide, sort of incentives and a framework for Jackie to be the kind of person that Meadow deserves. And so, it's not an ideal situation, obviously, but I think that's one of the places where he does the best by Meadow, because, he's trying to give her sort of autonomy and trust her moral judgment and not interfere too much, but he does want to protect her as much as he can. And it's it's an interesting balance. Obviously he does much better there than with Noah, Meadow's previous boyfriend, who...
Oh my god. The half-Jewish, half-black, pretentious Columbia kid.
He's so pretentious.
You imagine how Tony gets along with him.
Yeah, and Tony is obviously a racist, right? I think there's no real question about that. But Noah is so impossible. I feel like...
I know, that show never makes anything easy, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's never just one reading. So, like, is Tony horrible? Yeah. Is Noah completely insufferable? Yeah, he's horrible. Like, he's just the worst.
Yeah.
It doesn't excuse Tony, but it's just that show is not to go off topic, but that show is the best thing in the world. I don't know. Did James Gandolfini's death hit me in a way I really would not. Had you asked me, a week before his death, if James Gandolfini died, how would you feel? I'd be like, it would suck. He's young. I would be, really sad. But it's not a guy I know. But no, that hit me really hard, just because I think just because of how much that show means to me and how much that show's success was dependent on Gandolfini.
Yeah. No, I mean, I reacted the same way. I mean, obviously I'm a television critic, and so, it has a lot of implications for sort of my work and, for the specific anti-hero genre that he worked in. But yeah, I mean, I think that, and I was a little frustrated by the extent to which writing about Gandolfini focused only on his work with The Sopranos, which of course is significant in his career, but hardly the sum total of it. But yeah, I mean, Tony is this unbelievable character. I mean, we haven't even talked about his relationship with AJ, who, I mean, watching The Sopranos makes me not want to have children because they look so terrible. But, I've been rewatching the arc where Carmela and Tony consider sending AJ to military school, and again, it's this sort of tragic moment because AJ is this wasted kid, right? I mean, he's rotten. And, there's something incredibly sad about the swing between Carmela's just total and utter permissiveness, like her willingness to just be kicked by her kids repeatedly. And Tony, I think is correct in thinking that a course correction and some discipline for AJ would be a good thing, but they've raised a kid who's totally unprepared to benefit from any of that course correction. It's a scenario where I think Tony is probably right, but the mistakes they've made already are sort of so enormous and so tragic that the idea that they can possibly correct as parents is sort of, kind of out of reach.
And again, you talk about, you learn what you're taught, right? And I mean, what we know of Tony's father is he had the Gumar, he went out with the Gumar Friday night, the wife of his Saturday night. He was distant, and he chops off the nice butcher's finger in front of Tony in one of the traumatic flashbacks. So, I mean, what surprise is it that Tony, I mean, again, just yet another way in which the show just complicates everything. Do you blame Tony 100% for being a sociopath? I don't think that's quite fair, given who his parents are, but it doesn't change the fact that he's a sociopath. In terms of AJ, I mean, it's funny. I mean, the AJ arcs never got me as much as the Meadow arcs did, partly because he seems like he might be hopeless regardless of the way he's parented. I mean, he's just kind of weak. But, just thinking Tony Soprano as Father of the Year, it's just, It's hard. I'm thinking of, no, never mind, I lost the train of thought. But yeah, I mean, with the military school episode, remind me, because I haven't seen that episode in a while, why is it, AJ ends up not going to the military school? What, do you remember why, or did you see why?
I mean, it's interesting, he has a panic attack like Tony's.
Right, that's what it is. Right,
and so, and it's never explicitly discussed. I mean, Carmela actually sort of consents to send him to military school after being sort of violently in opposition. But he has the panic attack, and Tony sort of can't let him go. At least that's the implication, because he's, back in school next year and still at home.
And the panic attack, of course, is something that he literally inherited from Tony, much as Tony inherited them from his father. I mean, it's always risky to sort of impute, to compare genetic inheritance to non-genetic inheritance. But I mean, I think certainly in the show's symbolic universe, that's a.
Well, and I think there's an argument to be made. I mean, Tony is not without insight into his children or what would be good for them or what would be useful. But one of the problems is that, he's so thoroughly abdicated sort of parenting responsibilities to Carmela that when he tries to intervene, they have huge blowouts, they can't agree. You know, they, in part because he's not home and sort of hasn't made the choice to be involved, or to be sort of parentally involved, and a lot of the time, you know, they can't come to a unified strategy, which is a really interesting thing, you know, I mean, it's...
And I think one interesting part of that is that, you know, a lot of parenting, and this goes back to sort of talking at the beginning, I think a lot of parenting involves being at home. Because that's where the kids are. You know, I mean, it sounds trite, but it involves being at home because that's where the kids are. And one way you see this, you know, there's a great control experiment for this in The Sopranos, which is in season 5, when Tony and Carmela are split up. AJ can't take Carmela anymore and wants to move to Tony's. Tony, of course, doesn't want that, but it happens, and it completely doesn't work out, and it doesn't work out for either of them. And one gets the sense that it's partly because, I mean, it's partly that, like, I mean, imagine if you had to live alone with Tony Soprano. But it's partly that Tony doesn't know the basic logistics of how to, like, have... AJ's barely a kid. AJ's like a 16 or 17-year-old at this point. But it's like he doesn't have the wherewithal to even basically have this kid in his home. It reminds me of that scene, you know, a movie that Shirley regards revisiting in the wake of the Daddy Wars is Kramer versus Kramer, the Dustin Hoffman Meryl Streep movie from, like, the late 70s. And there's a famous scene... The point is that they split up, and Dustin Hoffman has to try to raise the kid because Meryl Streep's a working woman, etc. And there's a scene where Dustin Hoffman's trying to make his son French toast, and he tries to make it, and it's like as you're watching the scene, I recommend looking. I'm sure it's on YouTube. Like it's hard to watch because it's hard to watch someone like make French toast so badly, and like you can feel the soggy bread. But I mean, that sounds like trite, like. Fathering isn't making French toast. Well, that's not the most important part of fathering, but that's kind of part of being a parent, is making the French toast for your kid and doing all the other little domestic things. And it follows from that you need to be at home. And for the same reason you need to be at home to learn how to do the little logistical things about parenting, you need to be at home to learn how to do the big gestural aspects of parenting.
Well, and it's just a set of skills. I mean, that you're bringing up the French toast actually reminds me of another great sort of TV dad who it's worth talking about this week, Don Draper, and that amazing moment.
Well, great TV dad. I think by great you mean great.
If by great I mean great to talk about, not anything else. But you know, it reminds me of that moment when Sally is staying with him at his sort of sad little apartment in the city after he and Betty have divorced. And she tries to make him French toast and ends up putting rum on it, which she thinks is syrup. And that's, you know, it's an almost inverse moment where Don is so neglectful that, you know, he both doesn't have the correct things in the house and, you know, is literally willing to abdicate sort of child-caring responsibilities to his own daughter, who herself doesn't have the skills to actually take care of them. You know, it's a really...
Yeah, I mean, because as we know from all the flashbacks, Don Draper was brought up to see women purely as people who would take care of him, who are you know, prostitutes who take care of him. I mean, in the show is sort of over literal. God, there's got to be a dissertation out there on French toast and parenting.
Well, and why French toast? Why not pancakes?
What's that?
Why French toast? Why not pancakes? Pancakes require...
I think it's because of the complication of, like, you gotta, like, dip it in the egg and then do this just right.
But there are more ingredients to pancakes.
Yeah, I mean, it's a more complicated...
You have to actually cook. Like, French toast is not actually cooking.
Right, and then we have the Jewish version of this, which is they try to make matzo brie and it fails. But Don Draper's father. Well, so we should talk about the past season of Don Draper's father, where he's revealed new depths of... We talked about Tony Soprano making his daughter complicit. I mean... Draper...
Yeah, I mean, Don Draper, and this, you know, I mean, I think this season, I didn't like this season of Mad Men very much, and I like Mad Men less than I think most television critics do anyway, but it was very interesting to me.
Good for you. I'm with you. As a non-TV critic, I'm with you, but anyway.
Yes, I'm a little bit of a hater. But, you know, I thought there was something really interesting in this season in that it's sort of the inverse of one of sort of J.J. Abrams or Damon Lindelof's mystery boxes where, you know, there's a lot of sort of symbolism and mythology, but we never see sort of the mechanisms or how it all really works. this was a season that was all about Matt Weiner saying, like, look at how complicated a Rube Goldberg device I can build. And what it all builds to, of course, is Sally catching Don with Sylvia, the neighbor, whose son she sort of has a little bit of a crush on. And Don being revealed as not just sort of neglectful or someone who's gone off to live in the city without his kids, or, as someone who can't make French toast, but he's a rotten guy. And, I think that's something that we've known for a while, but seeing Sally experience that was really sad, and Sally sort of goes through her own, Meadow Soprano arc this season where she sort of sees what her father actually is, which for Meadow is sort of a two-step process, first with Noah and then sort of understanding that her father probably was involved with Jackie's death in some way and sort of withdrawing from him. One thing I've written about a lot, I think there's a strong argument to be made that most prestige television is actually young adult fiction that's about girls and their fathers. This is something you just see a lot of, but I felt so, and I think, Sally herself is not a particularly nice kid in a lot of ways. But, I really felt for her in that episode. That is a really sad
it's almost like child abuse. It's not literally child abuse in terms of quite the agency of the abuser, but in terms of the abuse received, it must be very similar. It actually reminds me of another thing from The Sopranos, which is when Meadow goes to see the shrink. A great scene, and tells her two of the best scenes in that show are when Meadow goes to see the shrink, and of course the super famous scene where Carmela goes and sees the shrink. But when Meadow goes and sees the shrink, who tells her to blow off her parents, one thing the shrink asks Meadow, and you can tell, she's been talking to Meadow, she's seeing how Meadow talks about her father, and she asks the logical question, which is, did he ever molest you? And the answer is, of course, no, that's not Tony Soprano's evil in many ways. That's not at all one of the ways in which he's evil, and it's the most obvious thing in the world to Meadow. But the way Meadow has been traumatized by her father appears to this trained professional not unlike the way victims of sexual molestation are affected, which is a really fun thing. And with Sally, we have... It's never clear whether this is a sign that she's troubled or that she's normal, but there's the episode where she's touching herself in the presence of her friends, which is a little scandal in their bedroom community in the 1960s. I don't know what we're supposed to take from that, but certainly one thing to take from that is that maybe her notions of sexuality are a little confused, but presumably by her parents and probably by her father. There's the way she, basically won't talk to her father now as of the end of the season. Her father has made her complicit in his own massive... Sexual mistakes. Think about the web of it. You want to talk to Rube Goldberg, she is now complicit in her father cheating on his second wife, who is not her own mother. Think about what that was.
Yeah. No, and I think... part of what was interesting about, the end of this season of Mad Men, especially if we're thinking about it in relation to The Sopranos, is that, part of what is corrupting to the Soprano children is the exposure to this larger environment and this larger network of, Tony's relatives, sort of people who are functionally relatives by the fact that they're made or part of his crew. They are in this sort of constant environment, and there's this association of family with criminality. Whereas, Don Draper's kids have no context, right? They obviously have never met either of his parents. They haven't met Anna. They literally know nothing about their father. He is this blank. And so when he takes them to his childless, whorehouse where he grew up, and I think he doesn't tell them that it was a whorehouse in the same way that he tells the Hershey's folks. But it's the first time they have sort of any context for him at all. And it's this big, sad house on a hill. It's sort of scary. It's this was sad, don't be like me, where Tony is constantly saying verbally that he wants his kids to be something other than what he was, but they see sort of the benefits that he reaps from being part of this extended network. It's a very, the sort of contradictory messaging there is interesting.
And Meadows going to end, after after the finale, AJ's going to be using his connections to do something, and right now it's movies, who knows what it's going to be. And Meadows going to be a lawyer defending, alleged mafiosi, so,
Right, because, her family's been oppressed by the FBI. I mean, the Soprano kids are sort of drowned by narrative where, the Draper kids have none.
Or the what? I'm sorry?
The Soprano kids are sort of drowned by family and narrative and history and tradition, and the Draper kids, part because Don is their father, and part is sort of a symbol of suburban ennui, they're rootless. They have no connection. They have no tradition, they have no apparent faith or, sort of ethnic background or anything else. They're just, they are sort of contextless kids, and it's very interesting to see their sort of blank reaction to Don showing them this true part of himself. There's just nothing for them to latch onto.
Right. And this is maybe just gets to the general relative weakness of the show, but the final shot of the Mad Men season where they're at his house, it's not clear quite how meaningful that's meant to be, precisely because, all it really means is that, I grew up in a neighborhood that used to be nice and now is run down. That's true of my mother. I've seen the house my mother grew up in, and it's fine, but I'm sure it doesn't look nearly as nice as it was when she grew up, because the neighborhood where she grew up has gotten less bad. It doesn't say anything about my mother, it's just, it's what happened. It's what happened in America. So, I'm not sure quite what the kids would have really taken from that, other than, wow, Dad used to live in this house and now it's run down, when in fact we know that there's actually a lot of meaning because it was a whorehouse, and it's, the other two differences is that, what Don Draper does is monstrous in any time period, but a lot of it is, to some extent, enabled by the fact that it's the 60s, and men and fathers, there are different expectations, and Sally has always known there's different expectations, and all her friends have similar expectations. Again, nothing on the level of what Don did, but whereas the amazingness of The Sopranos, one of the sources, one of the things that just makes it just an engine that can constantly, over 86 episodes, churn out new variations on this theme, is that you have this 1954 mindset, which is not just Tony's idiosyncratic mindset, but it's the concept of the mafia, which is this non-governmental / quasi-family institution set in the middle of modernity and of the late 90s, the end of history United States. Where it's completely weird and completely bizarre, and the expectations are completely different.
Well, and to get back to some of what we were talking about earlier, Tony is a man who has always sort of had models offered up to him about what he should want and how he sort of should behave and what he should do. And part of what's interesting about his therapy is, him starting to think about whether he wants what he has, whether he likes what he's done, whether he actually believes his parents were good parents. Don Draper, by contrast, sort of wrote this blank slate, or cleared off a blank slate for himself, and, rewrote a life for himself. But what's interesting is sort of his confrontation with the fact that all of the things that he sort of chosen and that he convinced himself that he wanted were sort of hollow. They had very different opportunities and trajectories to think about what they actually wanted, and neither of them has ended up particularly happy. I thought, in a way, one of the most striking moments at the end of the Mad Men season finale didn't involve Don at all, but involved Pete Campbell just being unwilling to leave his daughter's side. She's sleeping, she's not even playing with him, but, and Trudy telling him that she's sort of, that, Pete, you have everything you want, you're free of me, you're free of your mother, you're free of the suburbs, and you found out you didn't want any of it. And, there's a real tragedy to men's sort of inability to think through what they want, and there's something really sad about them not being given either the frameworks or the language or the opportunity to think those things through. It is, I think Pete Campbell is a weasel and a rat and a rapist, but he is, he's a tragic figure too.
Yeah, he actually, he's probably the only character who I've kind of grown more and more compelled by as the series has progressed. I think they've done a good job sort of drawing him out. I mean, including this season, actually. Him leaving Trudy, or whatever, or her leaving him. That was, I think, probably the most interesting development to me of this season. This season was a weak season, I thought. But
yeah.
But what do I know?
Well, I mean, clearly TV, I mean, in a way, I feel like the best place to end this conversation is to acknowledge that men may not know what they want or what it all means to them, but TV dads are a good set of things to stay very, very, very far away from.
Right. See what Don Draper does, do the opposite, you'll probably be at least okay.
Well, and with those words of wisdom, I think we'll sign off. Mark, thanks so much for your time, and let us know how the daddy wars proceed.
I got my draft card, I got my rifle. It's going to be tough, but we're in it for the long haul. We're hoping for victory, whatever victory looks like.
We'll sell you a little. We'll sew you a little Game of Thrones style battle flag or something.
Exactly.
Thanks so much for joining me, Mark.
Talk to you later.